Look, in this debate, I just don't think it is possible for side negating to ever argue against diversity, and that is how we win. 3 things for you in my speech. Firstly, some setup, then onto how these workplaces will improve, and then secondly, on how this will uplift women within these workplaces. Okay, the setup here, like obviously we've heard the industries within the within the motion, being things like nursing, teaching, and social work that do just have a disproportionate like representation of women. This looks like having like 20% men, the rest all being women. In terms of like this affirmative action that we're taking, we think this looks like DEI, where these companies or where these schools have things like a quota of wanting an increase of more like an extra 20% of men within like the next year in this industry. No, we're not just firing women to replace them with men. We just want the next few hirings to be men. This also looks like things like having advertisements to encourage men to enter these industries as well. No, we still are supportive of DEI and affirmative action for women in other areas, and we don't think that this should be sacrificed under our side. Okay, now firstly onto how workplaces improve. I think it is important to understand that these industries don't just exist to serve women, right? They exist to serve the entirety of the population, and that is really important. Okay, the first way and how workplaces will improve is we are opening a window of opportunity for men to enter these industries. Note that this works on 2 levels. First of all, it uplifts men who are already within the industry but may be doubtful with whether they should continue to stay here, because that is not necessarily as welcoming of a space for them to be in the first place. We think that this is just really good to try and retain these men to be here. Maybe this looks like going and applying to a different hospital because you know that there is a much higher likelihood of you being hired there. This is just seen as more stable for you. On the second level on which this works is those men who are just not sure where they should end up working. If it seems like it is a more sure bet for them to get into this industry, we think that this just incentivizes them to get into these areas, right? This looks like going and studying nursing because you are pretty sure or very confident in the fact that you'll be hired into this industry, much more certain than under side negatings, like case. The second thing now that happens here is we just see an increase in diversity. The way in which this mechanism works is we see a more proportionate level of representation between society and the actual workplace here. I think this is important on a few different levels. First of all, you see less bias within this workplace because there is more diversity of thought, opinion, and experiences. This influences directly how people behave. So when you do have more diversity, you see the sector being more supportive of like a variety of ideas rather than just focusing on the things that a set number of people care about. This looks like women care about really particular things that might be different to what men care about. When you have more women in the area, in the industry, there might just be less of a focus on things that might be considered to be important to men because they've just got less of a voice, right? The third mechanism here is the fact that men do bring unique skills to the workplace, right? Like they are just we know this, in the sense that women have historically been pitted against one another in both a social context and a working context. This means that it is much more complicated in the sense of how they work together. And so when you bring men in, look, there are studies that just show it is easy for them to bond with one another and they can get along easier. When we've just got more men, like you just again see the way in which they engage to be different. The social dynamics do change immediately. Okay, fourthly, the sectors who like tend to deal with like a variety of genders now like give these people more choice in who they choose to engage with. This looks like a teacher, a female teacher of an all-boys class not being approached by her students because they just don't feel comfortable addressing these particular issues with a woman. Note this is a unique harm under the aside. When you have less men, you have less really vulnerable people going and seeking help from these people because they just don't feel comfortable with it. This also looks like things like social workers who deal with uniquely vulnerable children because they oftentimes are the only support like level for them. So if a boy does not feel like he wants to approach a female, he now just doesn't really have a choice because only 5% of workers within the field are the sort of people that he would like to approach. This is a very unique harm and should be weighed very highly under the aside to the extent of damage. I'll explain it to you now. So no, these are the impact and the benefits that we gain. We see proportional increases in diversity within these industries. We think that this benefits the industry and it makes it stronger, it makes it like and it makes it more resilient and more capable of helping people. These are really large impacts because it impacts like the industry's consistency over a long period of time. When you've got more diversity and of thought and opinion, you've got a better capacity to address new and upcoming issues because like they just see things from a very different way. We also think it is really important for these sectors to be resilient because of the number of people that they can help. This can be weighed on like scale. And then the second thing here is the capacity of men within these workplaces to like work effectively just improves substantially because they feel like they've got more of a direct support network within the industry. This looks like when you go into a staff room and you see there is one table of all male teachers and like no female sitting around them. Now they feel like more included within it. They feel more integrated. So there is like more sharing of thoughts and opinions. I'll take a point if you've got one.
Yeah, don't you think that men already exist within those sectors, and is there a need for more men in them?
That's like literally my entire first point. But I'll just reiterate it, right? We think diversity should just be weighed really heavily because we've already told you that this just substantially benefits really vulnerable actors, and it does so on a very large scale. Just check your notes. Okay, now onto how this uplifts women. Okay, the context here is the same as my setup. The first mechanism under this is that these areas are going to be seen as more valued. Note that these tend to be like civil sector areas, right? This looks like being a teacher, nurse, all of those sorts of things that are publicly funded. I think it is really important to note here that there is a disparity in the like levels of pay that you see within the civil sector. This looks like a doctor being paid much more than a teacher. When you can weigh the level of impact on society very equally, we think that this is directly proportional to the level of historical engagement where men just do tend to take up more space in being doctors, where women tend to just be teachers more often. We think that this has carryover effects into today's world in terms of the levels of pay that teachers do just get now, because men's contribution is weighed more heavily. When you have more men in these like underrepresented areas, we think overall that industry and that sector will just be taken more seriously on a societal level. Okay, second of all, I think a really important impact here is we're not just like opening a factory to pump out more men to fill in these like sectors, right? They have to be coming from somewhere. This looks like men now entering more female-dominated sectors, meaning they're not heading straight into the male-dominated sectors. This is opening a unique window of opportunity without the need for policy changes from company to start hiring more women because they just have more of a unique opportunity to enter it. Like that's just how the math works out, right? It just becomes easier for them to become engineers or to be hired by really like good practicing firms and these sorts of things. The third thing here is like social equity movements get more buy-in on a really large scale. We think that this is because like they now are seen as serving a much larger group of people. This looks like feminism now not just being about women, but also being about uplifting all people. We think that this is really important because you're giving more power to these social equity movements. This should be weighed very highly because the level of scale of like the level of benefit that it can create. That is why we're so proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the first negating speaker.
When you compare the prejudice that women face in male-dominated fields as compared to the prejudice that men might face in female-dominated fields, I think the harm here is way worse for women than it could ever be for the men. Four things to do in this speech. Firstly, on responses. Secondly, on framing. Thirdly, on community-based care, communities, outcome, and characterization. And then fourthly, on feminism. Firstly, then, on a couple of responses that we've heard so far. Firstly, that they're not going to be pushing women out. I think at the very least harm, because of these quotas, a lot of women are going to be displaced from this. It means that they have to now redirect their trajectory into what fields they're going to be pursuing. And I think that's untrue that men aren't welcomed. I think there's systemic oppressive systems that exist for women in male-dominated fields that have disallowed them to be able to enter them. I don't think that mechanism exists for men. I think, therefore, the disparities for men are actually reflective of, like, maybe the demand that they don't have. But then on the point on feminism and how you should uplift women, how it shouldn't be just about women, I think why is feminism about women? I think it's because they're a very marginalized, oppressed group in society, and when you're unable to uplift them, I think that is when you get gender inequality. Firstly, then on framing and just some sort of responsive material. I think what we would rather support is advocacy for women to pursue more higher levels of tertiary education and ability to climb up the ranks and specialize in opportunities, and we reject the quota system. I think one important thing to characterize here is the gender gap exists within the status quo, and which is further entrenched when women are disadvantaged from the fields that they have access to the easiest. I think you break a system within the status quo that works, and you disadvantage women the most here. Firstly, then on the community-based industries, why are men unrepresented in community care professions, and does it even matter? Firstly, I think it exists due to genuine gaps in demand, because they tend to be lower paying and more highly emotionally demanding careers, which means that men don't face the systemic barriers that prevent their ability to pursue it. It's just that there's decreased demand for men to be in those fields, because men just don't tend to prefer those. Why is this? Unlike women who have faced massive barriers when pursuing employment, what men are likely to then pursue is more physically taxing jobs, such as pursuing the police force, construction, or sports management. Why? This is because they require the same amount of duration of education or qualification, and it is easier for men to get into these fields. I think women face the unique harm in a lot of these other fields, which means that they inherently face harassment in the workplace that goes disregarded by the higher-ups, because a lot of them tend to be male, and they face a lot of misogynistic values and discouragement. I think, why do men tend to perform more highly in these fields, and why do they have the better ability to enter them than women can ever have? I think it's because men tend to perform quite highly on physical tests. One, because of the biological advantage that they have with having increased strength, but also that a lot of these facilities and sports management and the ability to improve your strength and well-being are often catered to men, and they decide to them. I think a lot of sports supplements and muscle growth hormones often tend to prioritize testosterone production, which is often not as applicable for women, and therefore they're less able to support and be able to get more physically fit and be able to enter those careers. We can already see this in New Zealand, where 15% of the products that we see on our shelves for sports supplements are designed for men over women. I think this is a huge disadvantage. This blocks out women from being able to enter those careers. I think then men now just have a higher advantage in other careers. Why is this critically important in this debate? Because women can never be able to enter those careers, and when you block the pathway for them to be able to enter in a career that they can excel in, you push women onto the outskirts of society. It's unfair to push them out of pathways that they already have high success rates in. I think you force them into jobs now where they are systemically regressed, where they don't have better capacity to be able to enter them. I'll take that POI.
Don't you think that it is going to be better in the long run when you have more women entering male-dominated spaces, and that they have more of a capacity to change when they're in it?
I think then a couple of things here, right? Affirming action for men means that these quotas exist specifically for men, right? Especially in the healthcare industries. I don't think they can now just say that women have just the ability to move up the ranks of CEOs, because this just exists in the status quo. I don't see why they would now have the unique ability to be able to rise up the ranks as a CEO in an innovative company, because the systems that exist under the status quo still exist. Only the real change here is that now they aren't able to go into community community care professions, this is extremely harmful. I think, but then also the quality that they talk about like community care getting extremely better. I think that's untrue for a couple of reasons. I think the reliability or like the mechanism that they tell you or like you're able to relate to them more is untrue, because when a patient is sick, they probably care about the best care that they can get for them rather than the ability to be able to relate to them. I think also women tend to be more empathetic and they tend to be able to excel in these fields. I think men probably already exist in these fields. I'm not sure why you would have one male teacher, right? I think you probably have 3 or 4 male teachers in a classroom within a school, and you still probably have students being able to talk to them. I don't know why I don't know if there is such a dire need for male teachers, why there isn't more of a call of representation as there is for women in innovative fields, where we want women to create products that are designed for women. I think this is the field that matters the most. Secondly, then on feminism, instead what happens on our side is you have more women choosing to go into higher fields of education, because women have more higher educational outcomes, and therefore you see that women are 60% of graduates now. I think men have the availability and demand in these positions because men are inherently able to climb up the ranks faster. Because when a woman pursues the health career, they're normally discouraged from specializing and just choosing general practice, because it's harder for them to be able to specialize in long duration, because they have to have children and they have to give birth, and this takes away their time to be able to specialize in their career. I think what we then get here on our side is we just advocate for women and we just encourage them further in these fields and provide opportunities for them to be enlisted here. I think why is this important? I think men aren't going to choose aren't now going to choose those jobs because they're highly male-dominated jobs, because they're highly getting saturated now, which means that more of an equilibrium is created when women start climbing up the ranks. And now, instead of having a 50-20 ratio of CEOs and engineers and like civil engineers and healthcare professionals, now there is maybe a 50-50 like ratio, and now men are also going into healthcare careers, because the disproportionality up into the ranks has now decimated, and now there is more demand and availability for them to go into this. At the end of this, what do we prove here? I think we can prove all their benefits by saying that women are just better encouraged when they're able to go into the best fields possible, rather than when you displace them from the jobs that they already have. Why is this true? For affirming action, there's no action for women, right? All their alternative pathways are now redirected. What this means is you remove the capacity for a marginalized group of women into an even more marginalized group of women that have low-paying jobs, and give them essentially no means to an end. That is when feminism is harmed. For all those reasons, side with opposition.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the second affirmative speaker.
That's actually such a flip. That's so good. There's a lot of paper. Sorry about the I have a bit of a scratchy throat at the moment, so apologies if it gets raspy at any point. Do you need water? Just in case. Thank you. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. To a large extent, we have proved to you that both men and women are uplifted on our side, despite the constant push that prejudice is mutually exclusive to our side, and that they are just going to make women so much more empowered with what opportunity? None. So, I will also soon be extending to you that we are not only representing the 2 primary genders, we are also representing genderqueer people in my following split. So, what will I do for you in this debate? Firstly, I'm going to go over a few impacts of our second point that were left out so far. Then I'm going to go over how their model and characterization leads to a bad outcome for a lot of people. Then I'll follow through on my 2 main points of clash I've identified, which are community outcomes and feminist and social views, and then finally move on to my split, which focuses on the impact on genderqueer people in terms of feminism. So, quick
quickly over our impact. So we think that under our second point, money increases and like at worst there is marginal change, or we increase the level of respect for each individual person in a like type of job, right? I think if we see a proportional level of men to women, we therefore see an equal level of respect for these people in individual jobs. Secondly, I think women diversity increases just based on the fact that they have more opportunities in different job sectors now, right? I think this is very true, because if you add like men leaving to go to different like institutions for reasons that I will give you, you create lots of space for women to go into other places that they are not able to get into right now. And lastly, I think the power of social movement should be really, really highly weighed in society, which therefore means that you get like a high level of change if you make these social movements wider and you create more incentive for people to include various areas, which, yeah, that will flow into my split. So, now I'll go into quickly how like their model creates a bad outcome. So firstly, we're told that women are currently being displaced from fields and that like that creates a really, really bad outcome for them. I think no one is firing heaps of women. I think we missed this completely in our setup and it's been really, really mischaracterized. I think instead we prioritize educating men on why they should go into these fields, how their strengths play into these fields, and then we hire people based on their discretion and understanding, but prioritize men under a quota so that we create equal opportunity and therefore better stuff for the wider population. And then secondly, on their setup, we hear like, what is feminism about? They tell you that it's only exclusively about women, and I think this is a really narrow-sighted like understanding of feminism. Feminism is, from the suffragette era, about equality, about having men and women be equal, not about having women be better than anybody else, and not about having women be prioritized in society. It's about having both sets of genders be prioritized, right? Like, secondly, this like actively uplifts various gender groups, and we've already explained it in my first, and I'll further explain in my split.
POI.
So now I'll be moving on to like the community outcome, but I'll quickly take a POI.
Yeah, if that's true, why aren't women as easily able to go into the police force as men are able to go into teaching careers, for example?
I think that's really intrinsic, just based on the fact that women have been like constantly marginalized over the past few years in like physical jobs like policing, because that is quite a physical thing, right? You kind of need to be kind of big and like buff to be able to do that. And this is something that like just isn't seen and standardized in women, but I think it's intrinsically untrue, right? I think we shouldn't be characterizing women this way. And how we stop these women being marginalized this way is by creating equality and creating a vision where both men and women are seen in similar lights. So now I'll move on to community outcomes. So what do we hear first? Firstly, we are told like, why do gaps exist? They say that this is because there is a lower demand. Like men aren't not being allowed into these groups, like not being disincentivized to go into these groups. They just don't want to. And I think this is completely untrue. Firstly, because there is a huge bias and stigma towards men in arts and nursing, right? I think it's very true that a lot of society expects men to be tradies. They expect men to go into engineering. They expect men to be how society expects them, because it's not just women who have these intrinsic biases, right? I think a man who is now seeing that there are more people going into arts and nursing would be like, oh, I have opportunity here. I'm likely to get hired here. Therefore, I will pursue that career. It's not because they don't want to. It's because there's this systemic oppression here. Secondly, like, there are particularly gentle men and also trans men who are going to be particularly impactful in places like social work and nursing because they understand these really nuanced issues. I don't think it's fair to characterize men as, like, not able to do these things well, right? Okay, next we hear that men are like in professions because of particular skills, which kind of feeds on to like my prior rebuttal. I think this is sometimes true, because it is true that men do have like a physical like size advantage sometimes. But I also think, like, once again, they'll be skilled in social work and skilled in academia, as we've seen as like intrinsic gender biases have been gradually being lessened in our modern world. So next we hear that like this our side policy blocks women from entering like careers that they currently are being marginalized in. I think this is intrinsically untrue again, and I have two main substantive reasons for this. Firstly, it creates opportunity elsewhere, as we've already explained it first, but I feel it was missed, so I'm going to reiterate with a little bit of extension. So here we see men leaving for like a different kind of career choice or making different career decisions, and I've already flagged to you, because they have these incentives and want to go to different places, which means that we therefore create a big gap in opportunity in academia and in engineering and in trade, where women now feel as though they can find their ways into these groups. Secondly, as my extension, women still will likely represent like 50, maybe 60% of these like women-dominated fields, because it is still like something that they kind of are quite ingrained in for a decent amount of time. We aim to get it to 50-50, but we're not just going to axe women from these groups as they would like to characterize, which means that we therefore represent equality. So what do we hear lastly on this point of clash? Well, like, that there won't be better community care on our side, because when you're searching for care, you only care about like medical medical capacity and what they can actually do. I think this is just fundamentally untrue to healthcare, right? I think the best care is actually a mix of medical know-how and understanding and individual considerations, right? If there's a young boy who has had like a really traumatic experience with a woman or has had like a sexual assault case, they don't want to go talk to a woman about the fact that, hey, someone of your gender really hurt me, and this is really hard to tell you. They want to go see a male social worker who's going to better be able to understand their like views or better be able to understand what's going on. I think this is just very true. So quickly on like their second point of clash. Firstly, on like feminism and social views. Firstly, we're told that women who go into academia like will be more on their side, and that like they're going to have more women be academics. I think this like doesn't happen lots under the status quo, and we didn't have a whole lot of response as to why that this would be true. But I think it's untrue for like two main reasons. Firstly, with what opportunity, as I've already flagged, how are you going to create more like substantive space for these people to get to? And secondly, on our side, we make opportunity and push equality. And I think this equality understanding is really, really important to weigh here, because you're actually going to create space for women to be here and be understood and be represented rather than just trying to force themselves into academia. When you have equality, you see proper views. Okay, now quickly on to my split point, which is like the impact of genderqueer people in terms of feminism. So I think on some context here, most kinds of like socially influential feminism support trans women, and therefore they have had a big like representation in comparison to trans men. So like I see this because like they like there's work equity and more visibility by women uplifting trans women, which is something we don't see in like the trans man sphere. And therefore when you get this visibility, like feminism values do extend to men, as we've already flagged to you here, but trans men are often minimized because they kind of fall into a middle ground where people don't really know how to represent them. And I think we need to weigh this very highly on vulnerability. So how do we uplift trans men too? Firstly, trans men will finally be uplifted by a social movement, because right now there is no equivalent to feminism that represents trans women for trans men, which means that they're like unintentionally minimizing them, which means that we now have incentives for people to hire trans men into industries that they're statistically likely to care about, as I've already flagged in rebuttal. And we also destigmatize trans men in industries, which is an incentive for companies to be accepting and therefore have a better world. Secondly, we incentivize workplaces to be significantly less biased because of quotas and affirmative pushes that they can't skirt around, which means more workplace acceptance, personal happiness for these trans people, and actually creating a space for them. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for this speech and invite up the second engaging speaker.
In this debate, I think that if we can prove that the reason that men are underrepresented in these fields is different to the underrepresentation of women in other dominated fields, and they don't need this advantage, and the fact that they neglect females in these fields and they are the ones who have the most negative impacts in their worlds, that we can win this debate, and also the fact that any benefits they claim either aren't achieved on their side or in fact symmetrical or achieved on our side. Firstly, some response to some of their claims. They said that bringing men into these professions improves the social climate, as women are often pitted against each other. However, I don't see how this is exclusive to women on women and couldn't be applied to men on men being pitted against each other in these fields, or women with men, as they improperly mechanize this through quoting statistics that say that men are more likely to bond with each other. Additionally, they said that by providing affirmative action to men, they increase the numbers leaving male-dominated fields, and this opens opportunity for women, therefore elevating women as a whole. However, Ab seems to think that the reason men aren't in these fields is because they are scared of an unwelcoming environment and that they have barriers to entry. However, I think this is an improper characterization. as these professions
Point.
aren't inherently incentivized to men, and something that advertisation can't fix. They admit there exist male-dominated fields and that this system exists. So I'm not sure why on their side, men aren't incentivized to just continue into male-dominated fields, where they are inherently advantaged more, and are strengthened by mechanizations like the existing gender pay gap, and how more men are incentivized to go on their side. Therefore, I think their
Point of
claim that women
information.
are elevated as men are going less into these fields is not an effective benefit on their side. Additionally, they also claim that men entering professions like teaching and nursing improves
POI.
respect for the profession, which is loosely linked to a pay increase. However, I'd like to change this characterization, as no one looks at a nurse who is female and has less respect for them compared to if a man who was a nurse. This
Point of
simply
information.
isn't true. Any lack of respect is due to the concepts of the profession and not a factor of the gender. More men being teachers doesn't mean I respect teachers more, and this doesn't mean these fields gain a pay rise. So to say
Point
that
of
they will
information.
somehow affect some sort of social change which improves these professions by bringing men in, and this somehow changes a matter of respect, is again not a benefit they can claim. Additionally, they say that advertising will mean that gender
POI.
men and trans men are those that are going to go into these fields and otherwise are not represented. However, they themselves characterized as these people who want to go into arts and want to go into these caring professions, and they have an incentive to enter
Point of
them.
information.
So a female-dominated field, which would ultimately be more accepting to these people, I don't understand why on our side they aren't already entering these fields, and this again is not a benefit they claim. Additionally, they said that we neglect the boys who have undergone trauma potentially due to a woman, and that the fact
Point.
that there are no men in these fields means that these people are neglected, and this is a strong impact that we fail to respond to. However, I'd like to mention that men still exist in these fields. The fact that females dominate them doesn't mean that there are no men at all. Within these social care professions, it is unlikely that there isn't at least one man, and that this is an incorrect assumption on their part. If this person truly needed this
POI.
access, they still do have it under the status quo. So to say that we neglect these people, again, is an improper and incorrect harm on our side. I will now accept a POI before moving.
Okay, so we tell you about the fact that there are massive pay gaps, particularly within civil service areas that tend to be dominated by men versus women. So why do you think that when we prove that we get more men into these fields, it is unlikely for pay to increase too?
Because we tell you that the fact that men entering a field isn't what's going to cause a pay rise, as for some reason you think that men entering a field means that there's more respect for that field. However, I think this is an improper characterization. As we tell you, nurses are some of the most respected people, as they are a profession which works long hours and cares for each other. So again, men involvement does not increase respect and does not increase pay. This is a factor of the profession which is not affected by the gender of the worker. I will now move on to our first substantive.
POI.
Although not representative of all individuals, when compared to men, women tend to gravitate towards carer professions. Why is this? Women have some instinctual empathy due to the fact that they have the invaluable, important role of being mothers and rearing children. Again, this is not an accurate representation of every individual, but it is a quality that I believe can be attributed to most and something that can't be to men.
Point of information.
However, men tend to value positions of importance, influence, and dominance. While they do share some caring tendencies, it is less than that of women, and men tend to want to compete and establish male hierarchies, as is under the status quo with these male-dominated fields that they're
POI.
incentivized to go into. What does this mean then? The fact that women dominate these care professions is due to a lack of interest from the majority of the male demographic, and not because there exists a barrier of entry, as they say. This means that within a level playing field of entry, AF proposes that affirmative action for men.
POI.
What does this do? It only serves to turn a range of professions which is naturally inclined to women as another example of the gender gap, as men are given an advantage they don't need.
Point.
Again, if men wanted to go into these fields, they can. There is no barrier to entry that women experience in other fields. So, again, how is this example of male underrepresentation different? In male-dominated fields such as construction, the police, and sports management, there exists a barrier of entry to women as those fields tend to favour the inherent physical advantage that men possess. Additionally, as Af admits, there still exists the fact that more so than women, men still tend to be picked for high executive roles within corporate settings and roles which have a gender divide. The difference here is that in these fields, women are being chosen against, whereas under the status quo in care professions, the lopsided distribution is due to men not choosing to enter due to the characterization provided. They aren't being chosen against, and affirmative action only serves as another example of the gender divide to give an advantage to men. So, why isn't it inherently bad that women dominate these fields? Society as a whole tends to trust women more than men, as nearly everyone has had a positive experience with a motherly figure that cares for them. This idea extends to female nurses and teachers more so than men. There is a greater base level of trust, and what does this look like as an effect for the people they care for? Under the status quo, this means that patients have a better experience, as however small an effect, there is still greater level of trust. Instead, under AF's world, they don't see an increase in male representation as the characterization of the incentives that men have. The ones who are gentler and the ones who are trans, which they say we neglect, we think still go into these fields. And also, by giving hiring quotas to men who don't have barriers to entry, this looks like women who AF admits are underrepresented in the workforce as a whole, the most vulnerable actor in this debate, being looked past during the hiring process and losing the security of their small number of fields which they do dominate. This negative impact is so substantial that they cannot answer, cannot respond to, that I believe if you don't believe any of our other stuff, we win alone on this.
I thank the speaker for this speech and invite the third negating speaker. Sorry, third affirming speaker.
Look, if we really lived in a society where men wanted dominance and hierarchy, we'd all be running around every full moon, howling at each other and battling it out for dominance, right? Okay, 3 things in this debate. First, I'll touch on some of the unlikely things I think that we've heard from neg side. Secondly, a point of clash around incentives for each men and women to enter these industries. And then thirdly, a point of clash around how are we actually creating change, right? So I think we hear some pretty crazy stuff down the line that I'm just gonna touch on very quickly because I do think that it deserves a little bit of response, right? I think we hear firstly that men just do trust women more because they've had a positive mother figure, right? I think there's a few things to say here. Firstly, you can just have bad woman mother figures in the first place. I don't think that people just inherently trust women more just simply because they met a good woman, right? I think we can actually flip this when we say, okay, you've met a good man, right? If most people have a positive relationship with their father, I don't see why this is completely exclusive to their side. I think quite frankly this is also just unfair to men to say that all of them are just trusted less just simply based on the fact that they're a man. I think this has been asserted. I don't think we've actually heard why women are particularly much better than men at providing this care, just simply because they're more empathetic, right? We also hear that nurses are respected because they work long hours. I think this is just quite frankly unrealistic, right? Because then we just see a lot more respect for teachers, for nurses, for pretty much every single civil servant. I think the fact that civil servants are criminally underpaid and work horrible conditions in New Zealand just shows that there is a lack of respect for them in the first place. I think that when we point out to you at first that the sectors most impacted by this are nurses, are social workers, are teachers, are also the same sectors where women tend to represent the majority of workers. I think lastly we hear that nobody has little respect for women workers versus male workers. I think if you want to contend with the fact that sexism exists, this is not the debate to do it in, right? I think we tell you, secondly, I think we tell you that this actually knifes your case because then that means that all of your material on affirmative action for women doesn't matter because you just tell us that women have the same amount of respect that men do immediately, right? But I think that I'm just going to ignore this because I think our impacts still stand unto this point. I don't think it's that important. Alright, but I'm going to take neg at the best argument and move on to the actual strong material now, right? So what do we hear about incentives for both men and women? Firstly, under women, we hear that women are just less interested in male-dominated areas such as sports, right? I think we've told you down the line to pretty little rebuttal that the real reason that women don't move into these areas is because they are systemically harassed. They face objectification. You go into an engineering course and 90% of your classmates are men. You are one of the only 1 or 2 women. You have a creepy professor who has never been called out because the majority of their students are men who don't face this horrible treatment, right? I think these are systemic issues that are only solved under our side of the house when we bring more women into these areas, when we have more women representation, when there are more women able to call out this misbehavior and just a more supportive environment, right? Yeah. Now, so what do we hear about men? Because what we are told is that there's actual gaps in demand and that men have no real incentives to be doctors or teachers. I think there are 6 main responses to this. First of all, we do see men doing stuff like nursing, like teaching. So I think this is just firstly just a bit of empirical evidence that men do want to do these professions. But what are some actual other structural reasons? I think that what we tell you secondly down the line is that maybe a reason that men don't move into these industries is because they themselves feel uncomfortable and outnumbered. Why would you go and work in a school if you're one of the only 1 or 2 men there, where you have to go and sit at your little lunch table in the corner by yourself and just feel overall isolated, right? I think secondly, some of these jobs actually do have good benefits. Like teachers have very long holidays. I think just generally there are lots of reasons for people to want to go and work into these industries. I think that thirdly, men are actually good people, right? No matter what neg wants you to believe. I think that they do want to just do things like help people, like go into social work, because you believe that there is a big issue that kids deserve help, that maybe vulnerable children shouldn't just be left on the streets. I don't think that you can simply say that men just all want to go and battle it out on the CEO ladder, right? This just goes against your basic human needs to help other people. I think fourthly, this is just a job, right? If there is now a quota for a man to go into a job that is steady, because note that these industries always need people. Being a teacher is a stable job. You are not likely to lose this job, right? If you are now told as a man, hey, guess what, you can get a scholarship to go and study teaching, and you have a pretty confirmed and stable career for the rest of your life in a job that is unlikely to be taken over by something else, then I think this is a massive, massive incentive for you to go and actually work in this industry in the first place. I don't understand why just being with a slightly mentally straining is too much of an issue. And that brings me on to my last piece of rebuttal here, which is most jobs are mentally or physically straining in some way, shape or form. Alright, and just really quickly on women being pitted against each other, I just like to point out the fact that this was more of an example as to why men can be have like some unique skills, right? I think that what we kind of meant to say was that maybe men are just like more able to bond because they can just like play Pokemon and like have a beer and like all be chill, right? I think the dynamic between women is a lot more like conflicted and just generally different in society, right? So what does this actually mean? At the end of this point, I think that I've proven that there is like a substantial incentive for men to move into these sectors. I think that that means that because we have told you time and time again down the line how we get things like more buy-in to social movements, how we get more things like better conditions for these sectors, why this is so important in this debate. I'll take that POI.
If men are able to play poker with each other and bond, why aren't women then also able to pursue the same sort of values and have the same outcomes?
I think we just tell you that there are just intrinsically different societal like interactions between men and women just as a result of like feminism and the patriarchy and everything, right? I don't really think it's that important at the end of the debate. This was just an example. All right, lastly, let's look at how do we actually change the workspace. Now, let's look at what NEG tells you they're going to do. They tell you they're going to promote women into higher positions in education. I would like you all to know that this is exactly what the status quo does, and I would like to point out that this is not entirely effective, because the fact that under the status quo, which exists as their entire counter-argument, like their counter-argument is just like mirroring that exact same thing, and in fact, the need for it is they basically don't add anything, and I don't think they prove anything when we can look at what currently happens and see that it isn't entirely effective, right? So I don't think they actually bring anything to the table. What we tell you is that when men move from male-dominated jobs into women-dominated jobs, this clears up space for women in an area where they have been underrepresented, in an area where they have been like harassed, right? I think that what this means is that this becomes a more welcoming environment. You do see more women working, like moving into sports management or being like a tradie or being like some other male-dominated thing, right? I think we give you so many reasons at first that have gone undisputed as to why diversity is so important. I think this is a very big benefit we can claim in our debate, because if you do believe that workplaces are more efficient, that they're generally more tolerant and create a better, like more welcoming workspace for people, this is a massive scale of like benefit that we can claim. I don't think you can claim this at all, right? When we get told that men have like a better physical ability and that's like why they're not going to take these jobs or something, I think we can just flip this with a good example of social work, right? Because we tell you this is an incredibly important part of society when you are dealing with like the kids who have gone through some of the most traumatic events that anyone will ever face, right? I think we tell you that they come from like really horrible backgrounds, and often physical altercations are a big part of this job. If we have told you that men now have an incentive to move into social work, now we tell you that they have a better capacity to create change, and maybe they're actually more efficient workers than women in some situations because of their unique abilities. I think also men have a like slightly like better capacity to deal with the mental load of these jobs. I think what you should weigh this on is the time, right? Like we've built up the resilience of this workplace just by having more men in jobs. We have proven to you why they have the incentive. Now there are more men in these jobs. Now we just have better workplaces overall. We have given you reasons for this. I don't think I need to go over it. I think we get more buy-in because men now support this movement that supports them as well, right? That they don't just see feminism as something that excludes them. I think we need to weigh this on the scale and all of the harms that we can claim. NEG cannot claim any of these, and we win this debate.
Thank the speaker for his speech, and now I invite up the third negating speaker.
You should prioritise women in this debate over men infinitely more. They are the most vulnerable stakeholder that's been systemically disadvantaged for decades and for centuries, actually. They have the most potential for growth and change in society, and therefore we should weigh them more highly than any other stakeholder in this debate. We should care about them more because their unused potential is going to waste in the status quo, and we can actually use women to our advantage to help society improve immensely. On our side, we encourage women to aspire to great things. On their side, women continue to be harmed and never reach what they're fully capable of, right? Okay, so men have had the upper hand for centuries. The fact is, they're simply represented more, and we shouldn't keep undermining women at every step. Men simply get into higher opportunities, they get into higher occupations simply because they have written the legislation that's been allowed them to do that. They have they have created companies in the past that have built up into these big organizations that simply prioritize men more because men look at women as less than themselves. They see women as emotional, they see a woman as weak. They see that pregnancy is in fact a disadvantage to have in society because they're wasting time, they're wasting money, and therefore when men can just work more efficiently and harder. I think that we tell you that men don't want to enter these professions because they're given the opportunities that women simply don't get, right? They're given the advantage. We tell you that they're conditioned throughout their lives to believe that this is what they want to aspire to. So even if they had a natural calling for teaching, the very fact that they're given more opportunities and more ways to get into higher jobs means that they're actually just going to take advantage of this, right? They're simply not going to give up this opportunity simply because they want to get into a teaching job or a social working job. I also think it's a bit outrageous for the affirming team to say that they're going to open up more jobs for women in these higher occupations. I think this is a bit of a flaw in their logic, and the fact that men who are getting paid more, like big CEOs or people who have PhDs, don't want to then move down into a lower paying job. They simply don't want to move into a job that pays them less if they're already currently succeeding. You don't open up any jobs for women in these higher occupations, which we do get on our side of the house. I think that we see that women dominate in these civil professions, and it's not that they're not respected is why they're getting not paid. It's because it's a government job, right? The government jobs mean that they can't simply pay everyone and what they should be paid because there's simply not enough money to go around. It's not the fact that teachers are respected less in society, they get paid less. It's because they can't get paid more by the government. When you actually look at companies or businesses, they do have the ability to pay their workers more, and that's why you see men getting paid more. It's not because we respect men more in society than women. I also think that their main push in this debate is diversity. This uplifts men, it incentivizes men, and there's less bias and more perspectives that they bring. Men bring unique skills. I think we have a few responses to this. I don't think it's really exclusive to the our side of the house on diversity. I think we've already explained that because we encourage women to pursue higher occupations, that this actually opens up more opportunities for men to move through into the occupations that women are leaving, and women going into the higher occupations also get more diversity. I don't think diversity is explicitly unique to the our side of the house. We've explained how we've told you that men support, even if you don't believe all that, they try to push the equality point in this debate, right? I don't think we should necessarily stand for equality in this debate when we can stand for equity on the next side of the house. Women have been disadvantaged. This is just simply a fact, right? Men have had the advantage in society. We shouldn't try equal it out and then pretend like that never happened. Women deserve more of an advantage in society because they have been disadvantaged in the past. Making it equal simply doesn't cut it, right? Women are the most vulnerable stakeholder, as I've explained and as I've mechanized, and it's not enough just to say that we're making it equal. I think the fact that they introduce a quota on their side of the house actually undermines the fact of equity, right? You're saying that it makes it harder for women to get into occupations that they're all they're left with anyway. So a woman has to become a teacher because they can't pursue any higher because society hasn't allowed them to do that. And now you've introduced a quota that makes it even harder to get that job in the first place. So whilst they might not be explicitly firing women on their side of the house, you still make it harder for them to hire women. And I think that the fact that because this quota lasts forever, even if you do eventually get to a 50-50 standpoint, the quota will still exist past that. And so you're going to get more men in these jobs instead. And this creates another imbalance. And I don't think they can win this point. So if we really weigh diversity up with equity and what we've told you, I think we can also claim diversity on our side of the house because we encourage women to achieve higher jobs. Before I move on, I'll take any POIs.
Don't you think it would be reasonable to actually just remove these quotas once men are no longer significantly underrepresented?
It probably would be reasonable, but as I've said, there is still significant flaws within the framework that you've provided with quotas and the fact that it prioritises men when hiring, and men already have the upper hand in society. I think their other push is a social movement, right? But I would like to say this kind of undermines the social movement in general. You're saying that there is a problem in the status quo, that men are somehow disadvantaged and they're underrepresented. This actually undermines any social movement because it says that women who have been fighting for better representation are now held equal to some men who actually don't even care that they're not being represented in these jobs. I think what we really come down to in this debate is that there's no problem that the AF team is fixing here. Men do not get any disadvantage in the status quo for being underrepresented in these occupations. Women actually do. So the fact that we're creating this social movement and saying that men are underrepresented, it means that the women's movement means less in this debate. So what do we actually do, and what should you weigh this up against? I think that women, we encourage women more than the affirmative ever can, and so we can claim their points on diversity, and we can also claim that we have better social movement, so their two main clashes kind of fail. And so if we really look at the debate in totality, we've told you how women are the most important stakeholder, and you should weigh this highly in the debate. The affirmative team have not told you who you should think is the most important stakeholder, and I think that's probably why we win this. Thank you.
I take the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, reverse the speaking order, so I invite up the next reply.
Saying something intrinsically changes doesn't actually provide me with how it changes or the attitudes shifting. You saying that it intrinsically changes actually doesn't give me much. 3 things to do here. Then firstly on inequality, secondly on representation, and then thirdly on gender attitudes, and then a minor point on queer representation, which was underdeveloped and I don't think weighs highly in this debate anyway, after we already gave a response at second to no rebuttal after. Firstly then on inequality. I think the best case that they get here, their whole case hinges on a dilution of the framing that we gave you at first, Nick. They tell you that women are just disadvantaged because you aren't able to have enough advocacy. We already told you how we can redirect the advocacy that they get from maybe installing the quotas to you probably getting more advocacy at the top of academia and at the top of careers. I think why is this important and how was this not interacted with throughout the course of this debate? I think they tell you that quotas work really good because they just have more women flowing in because now that men are now not going into higher careers, the redirection of women is just inherently going to happen. We told you that's untrue for several reasons. We told you that they tell you that men face stigma, but we told you that women face systemic oppression plus stigma, right? This is an even worse for women, right? They have no response to this, right? At the very best, the point on stigma is probably symmetrical anyway, because women face stigma once they go into male-dominated fields and once they like are harmed by patriarchy. But then on like the point on advocacy and the problem that we're solving here, I think we tell you from first about the gender pay gap and how we're able to solve it, and like the mechanisms that we give you at first that don't go interacted with the point that if you have more women being encouraged to take these jobs and like being told at every step of the way that you can pursue this, and they're not just immediately discouraged from specializing, this has a better impact for women, now make up more of the ratio and are able to now be able to represent it. Whereas on their side, you cut off women from a job that they're likely to pursue. You just cut off any sort of mechanism for them to be able to climb up the ranks. I'm not sure how women are able to do it in this way. Secondly, then, on representation, I think they already concede to the point on systemic oppression, so that you just have to give us the point on sort of the values and how the stigma plays into it and how we present the most equality for people in this debate. I think there's two things that exist here. I think firstly, if it is such a big case that like a lot of men are represented and this is a huge call, I think there would be more calls for men to be in those professions, but there aren't any under the status quo. What we get instead, that we tell you at first and then again at second, is that there are calls for women to innovate better and for them to be in higher places of power structure, for them to be able to enact the most change possible. We want them to do innovation. We want the shelves to have more female-oriented innovation and products for women to get the best outcomes possible. I don't think we get many calls for men entering this field. I don't think that could be weighed highly in this debate. Then lastly, on gender attitudes and the actual characterization and how they work out in this debate. I think they tell you that certain careers get a low reputation because they're female dominated. We told you that's untrue at many points down the line. I think even in their best case, where there is some gender attitudes, I think that like we tell you that like these come from the inherent nature of the career, that like civil careers tend to just like be underappreciated by the public, even if they're male dominated. We gave you the example of police workers and even firefighters protesting for like more rights, right? I think this isn't something that they can claim quite highly changes in this debate. I think at the end of this, you should choose the team that gets the best outcomes for the most people in this debate.
I thank the speaker for his speech and invite up the F reply to close out the debate.
I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
Look, I'm just really sorry, but it is absolutely diabolical for negating to suggest that an engineering firm would rather just not hire anyone than a woman. Okay, a few things for you in my speech. Firstly, I'll be discussing on how women are affected. Then I'll be discussing whether or not diversity is actually needed in these roles. Look, they continue to tell us that apparently we just get no delta, we just get no change under our side because like men are like, I'm not actually that sure why, because it's hard for women to get into these places, I think is what they were getting at. But I'll just explain to you mathematically how that works out, okay? So, what do we tell you under how women are affected? We tell you that there are just more job opportunities in male-dominated areas. This is just how the math works out. Under their side, we have a group of 10 men. 2 decide to become teachers, the rest enter trades. What happens on our side? Even if we just get 2 more men to become teachers, we get 2 more job opportunities in a male-dominated space that now a woman can get into, right? Like immediately we just win. Even if the change there is so small, we just get women into these male-dominated spaces. Note that the fact that we win this immediately means we can flip all of their material that they give to us on the fact that it is really good to have women in male-dominated spaces. So I think immediately we take down what their biggest pathway to victory is, because we just claim all of those benefits under our side. They do not really give us a lot of material as to why women are more incentivized under their side to enter these spaces in the first place. Even if you buy all of the material that we're making it harder for women to become teachers, immediately that incentivizes women to go into things like engineering, entering the civil spaces. So I don't actually care what your responses are there. We can still win on all of those points. My time isn't working. Look, what we also tell you, or they try and tell us that there is no barrier, there is no barrier to entry for men into these fields. Izzy tells you in her speech that stigma is a huge barrier to entry, in the sense that men are just really scared, right? But also, I'm not saying that a doctor, someone with like a PhD in biomedical engineering is all of a sudden going to become a teacher. I'm saying that year 13 student who enjoys maths now feels more incentivized to go on and teach calculus, right? I think this is really uncharitable from their side to say that we're suggesting doctors become into lower paying spaces, right? So I think what we win on here is, once again, even if just 2 more men enter this space, this is a huge benefit. Okay, the second portion of this point of clash, I think we should just weigh on the change that we get. Even if this is small, we still get some change here. It is unclear what the change actually happens because they just don't tell us how this change happens under their side. The second part under this point of clash is in terms of payment and treatment, right? We're told that apparently nurses get a huge amount of respect, because I guess this is just a known fact in society. Unfortunately, that's just not true. We tell you that that's just not true. A lot of civil servants just aren't treated with the right levels of respect. But what we do tell you is there is a hierarchy within civil servants, and the ones who are treated with more respect tend to be the ones who are more male-dominated. They give us all of this material. They literally say men tend to be more respected in the workplace. Therefore, when we prove to you that more men enter these spaces, we just intrinsically get better respect, get more respect. I don't care if we don't prove that we don't get more money. What we do prove to you is there is more respect overall. This is just really, really massive on scale, because it is massively important for people to be treated with respect. Quickly on diversity, we tell you that thoughts and opinions are really important because it helps with solving problems. We hear no responses to this. This mechanism still stands. I think the queer stuff still stands because this is just a very unique pathway to victory. Even if you don't buy anything under this point of clash, we just win on that because these people are quite vulnerable, right? And they deserve a lot of entry into these areas. I think thirdly, what diversity is important for is giving people choice, right? They tell us that apparently you're just always going to choose a woman. It doesn't matter if she sexually assaulted you. You will just always want to go with a woman. I just don't think this is true. Overall, I think what we win here is the importance of vulnerability of these unique victims. That is why we are so proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for their speech and both teams for the debate. I invite you to cross the floor, shake hands, and then may everyone please leave the room to let the judge deliberate.